Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Thank you. And wasn't that music wonderful? Let's please give another round of applause to the musicians. They're some of our music majors here at USD. My name is David Harnish. I'm the chair of the music department and the faculty liaison to the Kyoto Prize Symposium. And it is wonderful to see you all here today. Before we begin today's program, may I remind you to silence your phone or put it on vibrate. I just did mine a moment ago, so please join me in doing so. At the conclusion of Professor Nussbaum's presentation, I ask that you remain seated in place until we've concluded the closing ceremony at the end of the program. Lastly, if you're one of our high school guests here with your teacher, please remain in your seats until the conclusion of the program for a special encore opportunity. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Timothy O'Malley, Vice President of University Relations at University of San Diego, who will deliver greetings and welcome guests. Dr. O'Malley.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of our president, Dr. James Harris, and the entire University of San Diego community, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to our 2017 Kyoto Prize Symposium featuring Dr. Martha Nussbaum. Dr. Nussbaum is the 2016 Kyoto Prize laureate in arts and philosophy, and it's our great honor to be hosting her here this morning. Thank you very much. In addition to Dr. Nussbaum, the University of San Diego's featured laureate, we are also joined this morning by her counterpart, the 2016 Kyoto Prize laureate in advanced technology, Dr. Takeo Kanade. Dr. Kanade. And joining us this morning, representing the Inamori Foundation in Japan, we're honored to have as our distinguished guest, Mr. Soichi Hamono, the Executive Managing Director of the Inamori Foundation. Also with us this morning from the Kyoto Symposium organization here in San Diego, the organization responsible for this remarkable series of annual Kyoto Prize events, we have Mr. David Doyle, chair of the board. David? As well, the executive director and secretary of the Kyoto Symposium organization, Richard Davis. Although Dr. Inamori himself was not able to join us this morning, it's important for us to acknowledge his great benefaction and foresight in establishing the Kyoto Prize. And so on behalf of all of us here today, let's extend our appreciation in absentia to Dr. Kazuo Inamori. Thank you. And now, as is the tradition of the Kyoto Laureate Symposium, it's time to share with you a brief video presentation on the Inamori Foundation, followed by a short introduction of the life of this year's Arts and Philosophy Laureate, Dr. Martha Nussbaum. Let's watch.
The annual Kyoto Prize ceremonies take place each November in Kyoto, Japan. The Kyoto Prize is Japan's highest private award for global achievement. It is given each year by the Inamori Foundation, which was founded in 1984 with the initial private funds of Dr. Kazuo Inamori, founder and chairman emeritus of Kyocera Corporation. Human beings have no higher calling than to strive for the greater good of humanity and society. The Foundation awards 3 prizes annually in the following fields: advanced technology, including electronics, bio and medical technology, material science and engineering, and information science. Basic sciences, including biological, mathematical, earth and planetary sciences, astronomy and astrophysics, and life sciences. And arts and philosophy, music, arts, painting, sculpture, craft, architecture, design, theater, cinema, thought, and ethics. The Kyoto Prize Symposium is held in San Diego, California, to share the ideas of prize laureates across the globe. The philosophy of the Inamori Foundation aims for a future with the proper balance between science, technology, and spiritual maturity, with the goal to contribute to the peace and prosperity of humanity. This is the core mission of the Kyoto Prize. Martha Craven Nussbaum was born in 1947 in New York. In high school, she experienced an eye-opening homestay in a low-income neighborhood in the UK. She was overwhelmed and shocked by how that environment engendered apathy and discouragement among her youthful peers, in essence, closing the door for their development. Dr. Nussbaum studied theater and classics at New York University and earned her PhD at Harvard, where she became interested in philosophy. Over many years, Dr. Nussbaum worked with Dr. Amartya Sen to advocate a new idea, that the normative justice should focus on the development of capabilities, what each individual is able to do or be, so people can unlock their potential and flourish. Under the capabilities approach, for example, poverty is reinterpreted as capability deprivation rather than a mere lack of money. Using this theory, Dr. Nussbaum has injected new insights into the discussion of human welfare policy and forms of assistance to developing countries. Her list of capabilities is cited around the world as a normative theory for human rights education, a base of assessment of human development, and a foundation for public policy in areas ranging from child welfare to gender equality. Dr. Nussbaum has devoted particular effort to researching the emotional origin of laws, and her conclusions influence penal policy and related legislation. She has analyzed the nature of negative emotions, such as anger, disgust, and shame, and she has reviewed many cases to examine how human vulnerability is connected to crime and penalties. Her work offers practical significance by identifying the underlying causes of problems and providing new pathways to solutions. Dr. Nussbaum has led contemporary studies in social philosophy and ethics toward a future of greater human well-being, continuously applying her findings to some of today's most vexing social concerns. Maintaining a strong sense of mission, she continues to seek ways of promoting the harmonious coexistence of different cultures and restructuring the public sphere. Dr. Nussbaum has taught at Harvard and Brown universities, and now is the Ernst Freund Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Nussbaum is shown here with her daughter Rachel, an animal rights lawyer. To young people, Dr. Nussbaum says, "Think about what you like the best and do not spare any effort to achieve it. Having said that, do not neglect showing your family and friends love and affection."
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lori Watson, who will introduce Professor Nussbaum. Dr. Watson is, in fact, a former student of Professor Nussbaum. Dr. Watson joined the faculty at USD in 2007 and serves as professor and chair of the philosophy department and as an affiliate professor in the University of San Diego Law School. And she is the program chair for the 2017 American Philosophical Association Pacific Division. Professor Watson regularly teaches Introduction to Logic, Philosophy of Human Nature, and Introduction to Gender Studies. She also teaches upper division courses in ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of law, and feminism. Please welcome Dr. Watson to the podium.
It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Martha Craven Nussbaum to you today. Her accomplishments will be known to many of you, but for those of you who are not yet familiar with her work, I will give a snapshot of some of her astounding achievements. First, it's worth underscoring that Professor Nussbaum is the world's leading public intellectual, in addition to being arguably the world's greatest living philosopher. The breadth of her work is unparalleled, spanning an enormous range of topics: women's rights, justice, equality, animal rights, emotions, law and religion, freedom of expression, the role of liberal arts education in cultivating citizens and civic responsibility, sexuality, disability, and that's just to mention a few. Her interests are indeed broad, but her work is deep. Her ability to assimilate an enormous amount of information, distill it for the reader, and construct precise and penetrating arguments in favor of her positions can only be described as genius. Her standing in the intellectual community is truly unique. Her laser focus on the most significant ethical challenges humanity faces presently, and as a part of the very condition of being a human, makes her an ethical leader and a standard bearer in a world that so desperately needs such leadership. I could spend much more time heaping praise on the long list of achievements Professor Nussbaum has accomplished, and underscoring the significance of her contributions to philosophy and public debate more broadly. However, you came to hear her talk and not me talk about her. I would like to say something about Professor Nussbaum, the person and the mentor. I was incredibly fortunate enough to have studied with her while I was in graduate school. She permitted me to sit in on 3 of her classes at the University of Chicago Law School and eventually agreed to be on my dissertation committee. My experience in working with her has been echoed repeatedly by others in the profession who share my good fortune in having been a student of Martha. She is an incredibly generous human being. She is generous with her time, with her intellect, and with her influence. An example will make this clear. The year I was on the job market, I ran into Martha at the annual meetings of the American Philosophical Association, where job interviews were then held. She greeted me with a hug and then said, "Okay, what can I do for you? Whom would you like me to talk to?" This was the same year she was the job placement officer for the University of Chicago and probably had a dozen or so students from there to advocate for. I could share another dozen similar stories where she extended her generosity to me personally, and I know so many of her students, all of whom remark with wonder at how generous and gracious she is as a mentor. So much of her work takes up the philosophical questions concerning what it takes to be truly human, what capabilities we must secure to ensure a flourishing life for all persons. For Martha Nussbaum, this is not just an academic question. She is devoted to securing the conditions for human flourishing for her students, for her colleagues, for women abroad she has never met, and indeed for all of humanity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Nussbaum.
Well, it's hard not to be rendered speechless by that introduction, but it has another side, which is that it's the engagement, the commitment, the brilliance of students of mine, graduate students, of whom Laurie is now one of the most distinguished, that makes my life so happy. And so I really have as much gratitude to Laurie as she expressed to me. I also want to thank very much the University of San Diego for hosting me. And what I want to say is that in writing about liberal education, I've always been very struck by the fact that, like other major Catholic universities, this university makes a very central place for philosophy in the undergraduate curriculum. That is not typical of other universities in the US or abroad, but it is typical of the great Catholic universities all over the world. And I said in my book, Cultivating Humanity, that all universities should follow this example. So I'm very happy to be here. Near the start of Plato's famous work, Republic, As the characters quarrel about how to define justice, Socrates reminds them, remember, it is no chance matter we are discussing, but how one should live. Political philosophy, as practiced in the Western tradition and also the traditions of East Asia, South Asia, and Africa, has always been a practical discipline, seeking to construct a theoretical blueprint for just and decent lives in a world full of division, competition, fear, and uncontrolled catastrophes. In this lecture, I hope to provide some reasons for thinking that philosophy continues to play an important role as we work together for a better world. I'll then propose some criteria for valuable philosophical work on urgent human problems. So first, why do we need philosophy? Most of the world carries on without it. In discussions of domestic priorities, philosophical theories of justice have received at least some respectful attention from politicians and economists. When we turn to the global arena, however, to debates concerning welfare, human rights, and how to compare the achievements and the quality of life of different nations, things are otherwise. Economists hold center stage, and philosophers, until very recently, were ignored. To some extent, this neglect is caused by the fact that economics is a fully international profession with shared standards, whereas philosophy is far more varied and as often speaks differently in different cultures. In part, the neglect is due to economists' impatience with work that is discursive and non-mathematical. Economics today has invested so much in highly sophisticated mathematical models that it attracts young practitioners who are basically mathematicians and lack interest in normative reasoning. They certainly don't like to be told to go back to square one to rethink the normative ethical foundations of their enterprise, and they're actually not trained to do that rethinking. Finally, the neglect is also due to a certain arrogance among economists who feel emboldened by the deference with which nations treat them, and who therefore don't feel they need to cooperate with any other profession, surely not a humanistic one like philosophy. This neglect is new. Early economists, such as Adam Smith, were themselves philosophers. Even much later, great economists such as John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek took a very keen interest in philosophy. Today, however, the disconnect is almost total. Of recent winners of the Nobel Prize for Economics, only Amartya Sen, with whom I have been privileged to collaborate, is also a trained philosopher. And even students and supporters of Sen frequently neglect philosophy when they consider how to forward or fittingly honor his ideas. Why then is philosophy needed in debates about global welfare and inequality? It's useful to start by describing what development economics was without philosophical input. For many years, approaches to poverty in the international development and policymaking world were obtuse in human terms. They focused on economic growth as the primary goal of development and measured the quality of life by looking simply at gross domestic product, GDP, per capita. That crude measure, of course, did not even take distribution into account, and thus it was utterly useless in confronting nations with a lot of poverty and high rates of inequality. And it was actually worse than useless, encouraging people to think that such nations, for example, South Africa under apartheid, had done things right. Moreover, as that example shows, the GDP approach also failed to take cognizance of other aspects of the quality of life that are not well correlated with economic advantage, even when distribution is factored in. Aspects such as health, education, gender, and racial justice. And once again, by suggesting that things were well done when nations simply increased their GDP, it positively distracted attention from these other factors. GDP, in short, eclipsed what really matters for people, which is the ability to lead lives that they value. As the late economist, the late Mahbub ul Haq, distinguished Pakistani economist who inaugurated the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Reports, wrote in 1990, "The real wealth of a nation is its people, and the purpose of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives." This simple but powerful truth is too often forgotten in the pursuit of material and financial wealth. That's end of the quote. One step up in terms of adequacy is another common economic approach that measures quality of life in a nation by looking at either total or average utility, where utility is understood in terms of the satisfaction of preferences. The utilitarian approach has the merit of caring about people. It measures quality of life in terms of how people feel about their lives. And it has the great merit of equal concern that Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, expressed by saying, "Each to count for one, none for more than one." That is, the satisfaction of person A counts for the same as the satisfaction of person B, even if A is a peasant and B is a king. Each gets one vote. So the theory is potentially very democratic, even in the context of established hierarchy, radical. That's exactly what Bentham intended. People who denigrate utilitarianism as cold-hearted or in league with big business often wrongly forget its radical origins and commitments. Intentions are not everything, however, and there are 4 difficulties with the utilitarian approach when used as a measure of quality of life in a nation that make it both less democratic than it seems and a misleading guide to public policy. First, like the GDP approach, it aggregates across lives. A nation can get a very high amount of average or total utility so long as a lot of people are doing quite well, even if a few people at the bottom of the social ladder are suffering very greatly. Indeed, the approach could justify the infliction of a very miserable life on an underclass so long as this strategy raises the average satisfaction level. Even slavery and torture are ruled out, insofar as they are, only by fragile empirical arguments claiming that slavery and torture are inefficient. Second, like the GDP approach again, the utilitarian approach aggregates across components of lives. The term satisfaction, like pleasure, the other term often used by utilitarians as an all-purpose metric, suggests singleness and commensurability, where real life suggests diversity and incommensurability. Think about the satisfaction you feel after eating a delicious meal. How can that be compared to the pleasure or satisfaction one gets from helping a friend in difficulty, or raising a child, or listening to a harrowing but profound piece of music? If you were asked, "How satisfied are you with your life?" the sort of question utilitarian social scientists are very fond of asking, you would be strongly inclined to say something like, "Well, my health is great, my work is going well, but one of my friends is sick and I'm really worried about that. And besides, I'm very upset by the state of racial justice in my country." Utilitarian social scientists, however, do not permit that sort of normal human complex reply. In short, the utilitarian approach seems to care about people, but it doesn't care about them all that deeply. And its commitment to a single metric effaces a great deal about how people seek and find value in their lives. I note that John Stuart Mill, Bentham's critical follower, but a great utilitarian himself, already made those 2 objections And it's unfortunate that economists do not acquaint themselves with Mill's work. A third objection focuses on the social malleability of preferences and satisfactions. Preferences are not hardwired. They respond to social conditions. When society has put some things out of reach for some people, they typically learn not to want those things. They form what we now call adaptive preferences. Sometimes adaptation happens after the person wanted that thing initially. Jan Elster's book called Sour Grapes takes its title from the Aesop's fable of the fox who starts wanting the grapes, but then he calls the grapes sour after he finds that he can't get them. But sometimes people learn not to want the good things in the first place because they're put off limits for people of their gender or their race or their class. Women brought up on images of the proper woman as one who does not work outside the home or who does not get very much schooling often don't form a desire for such things, and thus they may report feelings of satisfaction with their condition, even though opportunities that they would have valued are being denied them. By defining the social goal in terms of the satisfaction of existing preferences, utilitarian approaches thus often reinforce the unjust status quo. A fourth and final objection notes that the utilitarian approach focuses on satisfaction as a goal. Now, satisfaction is usually understood as a state or condition of the person that follows activity. It's not itself a form of activity, and it can even be achieved without the associated activity. For example, a person can feel satisfied about a job well done, even though she hasn't actually done anything, but has been deluded into believing that she has. Philosopher Robert Nozick made this point vividly by imagining what he called an experience machine, so that hooked up to that machine, you would have the experiences of satisfaction associated with a variety of activities, loving, working, eating, writing, and you would have the illusion that you were doing those things, but in reality, you would be doing nothing at all. Most people, says Nozick, would actually choose not to be plugged into the experience machine. They would prefer a life of choice and activity, even knowing in advance that many of those activities would end in frustration, and most of Nozick's readers agree. In short, the utilitarian approach undervalues agency. Agency can be valued as a mere means to satisfaction, and here there can be agreement between utilitarians and capability theorists, since we too emphasize the instrumental importance of freedom. Freedom to choose and act, however, is an end as well as a means, and it is this aspect that standard utilitarian models cannot capture. A popular alternative to the utilitarian approach is a group of approaches that urge the equal or more equal allocation of basic resources, understanding wealth and income to be such all-purpose resources. Now, this approach has the great merit of caring about distribution. However, it too encounters formidable objections. First of all, income and wealth are actually not very good proxies for what people are really able to do and to be. People have differing needs for resources if they are to attain a similar level of ability to function. And they also have different abilities to convert resources into functioning. Some of the pertinent differences are physical. A child needs more protein than an adult. A pregnant or lactating woman needs more nutrients of various kinds than a non-pregnant woman. A sensible public policy would not just give equal nutrition-related resources to all, but would, for example, spend more on the protein needs of children, since the sensible policy goal is not just spreading some money around, it's making people able to function. Money is just an instrument. Some of the pertinent differences, moreover, are created by persistent social inequalities. And here, the resource-based approach, like the approaches I previously considered, proves an ally of the status quo. In order to put women and men in a similar position with respect to educational opportunity in a society that has strongly devalued female education, we will have to spend more money on female education than on male education. If we want people with physical disabilities to be able to move around freely in society, as well as the so-called normal people, we will need to spend extra money on them, retrofitting buildings with ramps, buses with lifts, and so on. In neither case does the resource-based approach tell us enough about how people are really doing. It could give high marks to a nation that ignores the protests of marginalized or subordinated groups. Income and wealth are not adequate proxies for ability to function in many areas. They're especially bad proxies for social respect, inclusion, and humiliation. Even if we equalized wealth and income completely, that would not get rid of stigma and discrimination. There are some goods, moreover, that might be completely or largely absent in a society in which wealth and income are reasonably high and pretty equally distributed. Such a society might still lack religious freedom or the freedom of speech and association. Or it might have these things and lack access to a reasonably unpolluted environment. It was in response to these ethical deficiencies that the capabilities approach was born, drawing insight from Aristotle, from the British socialists T.H. Green and Ernest Barker, but also, in Sen's case, from the humanist thought of the Bengali tradition. Sen and I argued that the key question development needs to ask is, what is each person able to do and to be? Capabilities are defined as substantive, real opportunities that people have for valued choices. The first achievement of the capabilities approach is thus to shift the space of comparison. When nations are ranked and compared, we urge ranking them by capabilities, not by GDP or by satisfaction. But which capabilities are the most important? Given my interest in normative theories of social justice and in constitutional law, I then took the next step, asking which capabilities should be the focus of our concern if our aim is to design a minimally just society. Any use of the idea of capabilities for the purposes of normative law and public policy must ultimately take a stand on substance, saying that some capabilities are important and others are less important, some are good and some may be positively bad. Adam Smith, thinking of children in England who were deprived of elementary education, said that their human powers were mutilated and deformed. If we imagine instead a child whose human capacity for cruelty, which I'm afraid that we all do possess at some level, is starved and thwarted by familial and social development and inhibited by the criminal law, we would never describe such a child as mutilated and deformed, nor would anybody suggest that all people had a constitutional entitlement to the free exercise of cruelty. Again, suppose that we're told that a particular child was never taught to be capable of whistling "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" while standing on her head. Well, once again, we would not say that this child's human powers have been mutilated and deformed, because even though the capability in question is not bad, like the capability for cruelty, it's just not very important. My well-known capabilities list, which I believe you have a handout of that's going to go around or that has gone round, is a provisional attempt to supply this ethical content, saying that the protection of 10 central capabilities up to a minimum threshold level is necessary for any society that is going to claim to be even minimally just. I connect this threshold to the idea of human dignity, saying that only the protection of these 10 capabilities gives people lives worthy of the innate and equal human dignity that all possess. I won't discuss the contents of the list here, but I simply note that it's humble and revisable, and that ample room is left for every nation to specify its content in different ways in accordance with its history and its circumstances. More recently, I've been doing work co-authored often with my daughter Rachel, an animal rights lawyer, to extend the approach to address the entitlements of non-human animals. Okay, so from this account of my theory of justice, it's possible to get a sense of why philosophy matters in the development debate. However, it's not enough to say the world needs philosophy, for philosophy takes many forms, some of those not conducive to a useful global dialogue about the enhancement of human welfare. To the task of supplying some norms for my own profession, I now turn. So there are many world philosophical traditions, and in each there are different, usually opposing currents. More needs to be said, then, about what types of philosophy can really help the progress of humanity. So now I'm going to set out 6 criteria for philosophical work that can be truly helpful. Number 1, rigor and transparency. Philosophy, as I understand and love it, begins with the Socratic commitment to careful and explicit rational argument and to transparency of speech. Socrates' aim was to show people the inner structure of their own thinking, or at times the lack of clarity or structure in their thinking. And he did this by eliciting hidden assumptions, arranging the premises in order, and showing what conflicts and contradictions emerged when everything was set out clearly. At every step, Socrates and the person being questioned have to agree. Indeed, Socrates famously insisted that he himself added nothing. He was simply what he called a midwife, eliciting thoughts that belonged to the person he talked to and setting those thoughts in a perspicuous order. This commitment to reason has social importance. As Socrates saw, most thought in political life is sloppy, full of unclearly defined terms, fallacious reasoning, and hidden or not so hidden contradictions. When thought is sloppy, we don't make progress. We talk past one another rather than understanding one another and really deliberating. Socrates said that he was like a gadfly, a stinging insect on the back of the Athenian democracy, which he compared to a noble but sluggish horse. In other words, making clear and rigorous arguments is a way of waking democracy up so that public deliberation is conducted in a more productive and less confused way. Clarity in argument is also a way of respecting other people. Nothing is concealed and nothing relies on privileged or esoteric knowledge. Rational argument is common to us all, and Socrates insisted that rational argument must be forthright and not marred by hidden areas of secrecy and privilege. What this means is that philosophical argument in the public square should be written or spoken in a manner that is comprehensible to any person who makes a serious effort. Socrates approached people of many types, and he always spoke in a way that all could understand, not just a small elite. Plato dramatizes this in his dialogue Meno by having Socrates speak with a slave boy who, because of the oppression of enslaved populations, could not read or write. Nonetheless, this boy is able to understand quickly the structure of Socrates' argument, and he proves able even to come up with a complicated geometrical theorem when suitably questioned. What does this mean for philosophy today? For hundreds of years in the Western tradition, political philosophers more or less followed Socrates. But in the early modern era, they did so more by necessity than by choice. Social outsiders and nonconformists including philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill, were not able to hold university positions, which required statements of orthodox Christian belief. So they were forced to publish in journals of popular opinion or to write popular books. They kept their writing style clear because they knew that they had to have a wide public audience. With the growth of the modern university, we have all gained a lot. Those of us who are lucky enough to teach in rights-protecting liberal democracies have a secure income. If we once attain tenure, we cannot be removed for political reasons or indeed for any reasons short of criminal misconduct. And we have guarantees of academic freedom. These things are very precious, and we must fight to retain them. But with that freedom has gone at times a tendency to write for elites only, for one's own professional in-group, and to refuse to use a transparent language that addresses all people. I have no objection to dense and even technical arguments, which are frequently valuable in political philosophy as in economics. Philosophy should not leap ahead to attractive conclusions, forgetting about the deep theoretical issues that are often an integral part of justifying one's conclusions or the complicated matter of working out the details of an argument. Nor am I saying that even public philosophy should not be difficult. Most great works of political philosophy, from Plato's Republic to John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, are very difficult books. But they are not esoteric books. They are routinely taught to undergraduates. Furthermore, a philosopher who writes a long and difficult treatise is also, I think, then obliged to create a more accessible version of it for the general public. And that more public version must be one that respects readers and argues with them. Above all, there are two types of philosophical writing that are not helpful to the progress of humanity. The first is cultish writing, writing that does not respect the reader as an equal. Philosophers are flawed human beings, and many of them want power over others. It's all too easy for them to succumb to the lure of esotericism, saying, "Become my follower, my initiate, and only then can you comprehend the important truths that I am going to reveal." That form of philosophy, however, is basically totalitarian. Socrates, however much he criticized the actual workings of democracy, was a Democrat. The line between baneful esotericism and necessary difficulty is not obvious or undisputed. I consider Martin Heidegger to be a central case of baneful esotericism, and of course his ideas developed in connection with his adulation of Hitler and his desire, in fact, realized desire to play a role in that fascist government. Transparency was not a goal that he valued. But Heidegger's great German predecessor, Hegel, is also often guilty of esoteric and jargon-laden writing. Although Hegel was certainly a liberal Republican and not a totalitarian, and was also, I think, an important philosopher, he allowed the professionalization of philosophy within the German university to lead him astray into unsound habits, as was already observed by Goethe in his conversations with Eckermann. Because Hegel is both important and deeply flawed, we've had a whole industry of making Hegel available for the current conversation within political thought, including one of my predecessors in this award, Charles Taylor. The second thing that is not helpful is showy, flashy writing. Philosophy is serious business, and when philosophers show off, drawing attention to themselves, trying to be pop stars in our era of evanescent celebrity, that too disserves the cause of philosophy. Number two, respect for other disciplines. When philosophy began in the Greek and Roman world, and also in the various philosophical traditions of Asia, it basically contained all of rational inquiry. What was outside was tradition, mysticism, and so on. But philosophy at that early date contained physics, chemistry, biology, cosmology, linguistics, and even history. Those disciplines gradually spun off like planets from a star and became their own separate disciplines. But until the 20th century, philosophy still contained what we now call the social sciences: economics, psychology, anthropology, political science, and sociology. The American Philosophical Association, at its founding in the late 19th century, prominently included psychologists, and early presidents of the association were, in some cases, psychologists, or, like the great William James, both philosophers and psychologists. Economics was a part of philosophy in the time of Adam Smith in the 18th century, whose professional chair was actually in philosophy, and of Karl Marx in the 19th, and his doctorate was also in philosophy. As I've said in the first part of this lecture, this separation has had costs on the side of the social sciences, who all too often forget that they might have something to learn from philosophy. But the same thing is clearly true of philosophers. Being in their own separate department, they forget that they need to care about the other disciplines and to draw on them for illumination. This need for cross-disciplinary curiosity and learning arises in different ways in connection with different philosophical problems. Historians of philosophy have a particular need to understand the cultural and political history of the regions in which the philosophers they study lived and worked. Philosophers working on the emotions, as I have done, have an urgent need to understand the contributions of psychology and anthropology. And in my work on the emotions, I really have drawn extensively on these disciplines. Normative political philosophy of the sort I do, working on development issues, has an urgent need to understand what economists and political scientists have been doing in development studies. And it's not surprising that we now find graduate programs called development studies that promote interdisciplinary conversation, though I'm afraid that too few of these programs give a secure home to philosophy. I would add that political philosophers working on development need to learn a lot more history and politics and law than they usually do when they write about regions of the world not their own. When I began work on the book that later became Women and Human Development, I noticed that quite a few good philosophers were addressing the problems of women in developing countries, but typically they would take one example from Iran, one example from China, and so on, without engaging in detailed study of any particular region of the world. The result was that they were unable to contextualize their examples, not knowing how regional, religious, cultural, legal, and historical differences within the country affected the particular case they observed. I decided to do things differently, and I've engaged in a deep, multi-regional study of India, its history, its political and legal traditions, before I wrote anything of that book. From that time onward, I've always focused my work on India, and I learn more all the time. But other members of our multidisciplinary Human Development and Capability Association contribute their expertise about other areas of the world. When knowledge was smaller and there were fewer disciplines, it was easier for philosophers to know what they needed to know. Aristotle was a great physicist, psychologist, economist, etc., as well as what we would now call a philosopher. Although I note that even he drew the line at history. He asked his students to write up the histories of 153 known political communities so that he could use the results of their research. Even much later, it was possible for Adam Smith to be one of the greatest economists, a philosopher of distinction, and a professor of legal thought. It was possible, too, for William James to achieve eminence in both philosophy and psychology. But now that knowledge has expanded and the disciplines have separated, philosophers must contrive forms of collaboration and partnership to provide access to essential knowledge. One way philosophers can learn what they need to learn is by being part of an interdisciplinary university community. And I've always found being partly in a law school especially fulfilling in that regard, since then it's possible to work and teach every day with economists, historians, and experts in a variety of other areas. Co-authorship is also valuable, though too rare in philosophy. I especially value my co-authored projects with the legal economist Saul Levmore. We have a forthcoming book on aging. And those collaborations have taught me a great deal and also made my work more fun. I teach a course on global inequality with another economist, and I teach issues of discrimination and sexuality with an expert in constitutional law. The modern university is fond of hyper-specialization, and we must each find our own ways of avoiding being trapped. Number 3, respect for religious belief and practice. For much of its history in the Western tradition, although not during the medieval era, philosophy has been a skeptical critic of dominant forms of religious belief and practice. The pre-Socratic philosophers challenged traditional religious accounts of natural phenomena, which invoke the activity of gods in our world by producing naturalistic causal accounts of how things happen. Socrates was charged with subverting the gods of the city and inventing new gods. Aristotle's God was an abstraction, totally different from the gods that most people worshipped. Most leading philosophers of the 18th century, similarly, were deists. That is, they accepted the existence of some type of abstract God, but they understood God in a rationalistic way, as an immanent order in nature. In the 19th century, philosophers such as Auguste Comte, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill went even further. They argued that religion has no social utility and would soon wither away, to be replaced by a humanistic philosophical doctrine of human brotherhood. Although Karl Marx's views were in many respects very different from the views of this group, Marx agreed with them that religion was a primitive force, an opiate of the masses, and he anticipated its demise. Today, philosophers should not think this way. We observe that under conditions of freedom, and indeed wherever there is not the most brutal repression, people in every part of the world turn to religions for insight, community, meaning, and guidance. Many people reject religion, but many reasonable people do not. Moreover, among the people who consider themselves religious in some regard, there's not much agreement about what that commitment entails. Respecting one's fellow citizens means respecting their choice to live their lives in their own way, by their own doctrines, so long as they do not invade the basic rights of others. This idea of respect, which John Rawls called the idea of political liberalism, requires a lot from political institutions. First, it requires extensive protections for the freedom of religious belief and practice, wherever that freedom does not violate the rights of others. Saying what those limits are is a very difficult matter, and my own nation is currently embroiled in struggles over exactly what people may do in the name of their religion to express their disapproval of gays and lesbians or transgender people. Often that disapproval expresses itself in ways that many, including I myself, take to violate these people's fundamental rights. But these disputes are far from settled. Second, equal respect requires a vigilant opposition to any form of established church, which, even if it does not invade the liberty of non-adherence, does always send signals of hierarchy and exclusion to outsiders. And third, it also requires, in connection with that idea of non-establishment, that basic political principles must be formulated in a neutral language, neither that of any particular religion, nor even taking sides in the larger dispute between religion and non-religion. Principles must be abstemious, expressed in a thin sort of minimalist language, not using metaphysical concepts that belong to one religious tradition rather than another. Otherwise, even if freedom is respected, we get what I would call expressive subordination, where society announces that one doctrine is preferred and others dispreferred. And in order to respect religious liberty sufficiently, principles must also be narrow, not pronouncing on all matters on which citizens differ. Political philosophers then should operate within that restricted space. They should seek principles that can ultimately be embraced by all citizens who endorse basic values of equal respect and are willing to respect the good faith views of others. How could such a meeting ground possibly be found? The answer already exists in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other founding documents of the international human rights movement, namely in ethical ideas of human dignity, human equality, and rights, and I would then add to that human capabilities. As the framers of the Universal Declaration discovered, these ideas can unite people otherwise different in religion and worldview. For these reasons, I've insisted that the capabilities list is not a comprehensive account of the worthwhile human life, but rather a narrow and non-metaphysical list for political purposes that can ground political entitlements in a pluralistic society. Although my interpreters often ignore that part of my argument, I consider it especially important. Number 4, curiosity about and respect for the world's many philosophical traditions and interest in establishing a cross-cultural philosophical dialogue. All departments of philosophy in the United States and Europe are really departments of Western philosophy. Only rarely is there any inclusion of the philosophical traditions of Asia and Africa. If those traditions are taught, it's usually in other departments, religion, South Asian studies, East Asian studies, and so on. But of course, that is itself distorting, leading to a neglect of the mainstream philosophical issues within each of those traditions. For example, to a focus on mystical religion in the study of India and a neglect of India's traditions of logic, epistemology, and philosophy of science. Above all, there's little dialogue between scholars who pursue Western philosophy and scholars who are expert in these other traditions. A further problem is that while Western philosophy gets coverage over its entire history, Asian philosophy is thought to be truly Asian only when it is very old. Thus, people think about Confucius and Mencius when they think about Chinese thought, but neglect the creative work being done by contemporary Asian philosophers, or they consider ancient Hindu and Buddhist thought to be truly Indian while neglecting the great 20th century Indian philosopher Rabindranath Tagore. Western philosophers don't make the same mistake about their own traditions. They know that philosophy is a living and growing set of arguments, that John Rawls is a part of the tradition that began with Socrates. Well, there's no easy fix for these problems. In particular, I'm known to all my colleagues as a stickler for linguistic expertise, and I will not even consider for a faculty appointment anyone who does not demonstrate the highest level of expertise in the original language of, or languages of the philosophers he or she studies. That's hard enough, but then you have to insist on the same standards for your PhD students. So it probably makes no sense for any but the largest departments to try to be pluralistic in the historical traditions they cover at the graduate level, since it's hard enough to find graduate students competent to work on Plato or Aristotle or even Descartes in the original languages. And it would certainly right now be impossible to find a critical mass of US graduate students who had the linguistic preparation to work on Buddhist logic or on Mencius. Tagore actually is different because he wrote all his philosophical works in English. So what do I recommend? First, I recommend much greater awareness of the one-sidedness of our current approach. Thus, the expression ancient philosophy should never, I think, be used as it now is, usually in the US, to refer to the Greco-Roman tradition. If that's what people mean, let them say ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, as I have long insisted and annoyed my colleagues into doing. And again, if people use the word classics to mean the Greek and Roman classics, I give the same reply. You don't really mean the Sanskrit or African or Chinese or Japanese classics, so you should say what you mean. Precise language makes us aware of the partiality of our own approach and the rich plurality of our world. Second, and more substantive, philosophers should search for opportunities for dialogue and learning. One avenue is co-teaching, often a way to learn more about an unfamiliar tradition without having to learn all the languages oneself. So I've co-taught courses with colleagues in the South Asian Studies Department, for example. But another strategy is conferences. I recently attended a very illuminating conference on the philosophy of crime and punishment in Hong Kong, at which we had illuminating discussions comparing Asian and Western traditions. My own university is hosting next month a big conference on African and Western philosophy, inviting a group of leading African philosophers to come to Chicago to exchange ideas with those of us whose primary orientation is Western, and to see what avenues of cooperation might be opened up. This sort of thing is really essential if global problems are to be confronted on a basis of mutual respect and understanding. Number 5, concern with previously excluded voices. Western philosophy has not simply excluded the rest of the world, it has excluded, for the most part, and for most of its history, the voices of women and racial minorities, of gays and lesbians, and of people with disabilities. Today, this is much less true, and a great part of my own work in philosophy is feminist in nature. Feminist philosophy today, which really joins up with lesbian and gay philosophy and now trans philosophy, is an influential part of philosophy, and it's internally diverse, containing many approaches and arguments. The same is true of the philosophy of racial equality and the philosophy of disability. These changes in philosophy were long overdue, and they have been extremely valuable. However, they are not yet sufficiently integrated into the whole work of the profession, and this integration and the perpetual atmosphere of healthy critique that it prompts should continue if philosophy is to contribute justly to the service of humanity. And finally, number 6, concern with real human life in all its messiness and complexity. Philosophers are often fond of neat and highly general theories that omit a great deal of the complexity of life. General theories can illuminate, and we need them. But in the ethical and political area, they will impede understanding if they omit too much of the messy detail and complexity of real human lives. This is one reason why I have long insisted that philosophy needs a partnership with literature. But philosophy itself should educate itself to understand the messier aspects of human life better. Study of the emotions and the imagination, once central topics in Western philosophy, from Plato straight through the medieval period to the 18th century, fell out of fashion for more than 200 years. And this was an immense loss. I've tried to restore the area of emotion to the center of philosophical work, where it was when Aristotle wrote his Rhetoric or the Stoics their major ethical works. I think this insurgency of mine has succeeded, and there's currently a lot of good work in the area of emotion and more generally what is known as moral psychology. But we always need to beware of simplification and reduction. We need, for example, to bear in mind the fact that emotions are in part social artifacts and vary with the cultural tradition within which people grow up. This makes their study very difficult, but complexity and difficulty should not prevent us from confronting the whole issue. Philosophy can serve humanity, and indeed it ought to. The world needs the ideas that good ethical and political philosophy contains, and we who lead privileged lives in the academy would be profoundly selfish if we did not try very hard to bring those ideas into the world where social and political decisions are made. But philosophy also needs to criticize itself, and in some ways to change itself if it is to serve the world well. And it's fortunate that there are so many gifted young people eagerly taking up that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nussbaum, for that wonderful presentation. Next, I would like to call to the podium David Doyle to give some comments from the Kyoto Symposium organization. Mr. Doyle.
Well, Dr. Nussbaum, all I can say is, wow. You are just a powerhouse of thought and logic and caring that is just, so encouraging and inspirational. Thank you very much for your talk. Well, we have done it again. I'm proud to announce the official conclusion of this year's Kyoto Symposium events. And I do so again. I want to express our gratitude to the Inamori Foundation for choosing San Diego as the city to share with Kyoto the celebration of the Kyoto Prize. Thank you, Shiomi, and thank you very much for giving us this great honor and opportunity. And of course, I join in our constant but very important recognition of Dr. Inamori, which is the source of all of this that we have come to enjoy and that has made such a contribution to our lives. The ideas and achievements of each of our 2016 laureates are fundamentally changing our lives. Dr. Takeo Kanade is changing how things and each of us move in our day-to-day lives. There's nothing more fundamental than that. Dr. Tasuko Hanjo is changing how we treat cancer, the disease that has perplexed and afflicted so many people for so long. And as we've just heard, Dr. Martha Craven Nussbaum is changing how we can and should think about addressing such vexing problems as crime, poverty, disabilities, discrimination. We have been moved by sharing your inspiration and passion over the last 3 days. Thank you. And would you please stand so we can give you one more round of applause? And of course, that was so enthusiastic, a round of applause that hopefully Dr. Hanjo could hear that in Japan, where he unfortunately had to return. My final remark is to extend a very large thank you to the people and organizations who have worked together so hard and so well to make the 2017 Prize Symposium such a success. The result of your collective efforts each year, just like each of our laureates, is positively changing our community. And I look forward to seeing and celebrating again with all of you next year as we conduct the 2018 Kyoto Symposium events. Thank you very much, and please continue to support the organization as you have done so well for us in the past.